The desert heat shimmered off the tarmac like liquid fire, but Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez barely noticed as she worked beneath the belly of the AH-64 Apache helicopter. Her calloused hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting the feed mechanism of the M230 chain gun that had been jamming during yesterday's patrol. Sweat dripped from her forehead onto the hot metal, evaporating instantly in the scorching Afghan afternoon. Elena had been working on aircraft weapons systems for 8 years, but her journey to this remote forward operating base had been anything but ordinary. Most people saw her now and assumed she'd always been a mechanic, a tough woman in her early 30s with oil-stained coveralls and grease under her fingernails. They didn't know about the years before, about the training that had pushed her body and mind to limits most people couldn't imagine. The minigun's barrel assembly came free, with a metallic click that echoed under the aircraft's frame. Elena examined the worn parts, noting where the heat had warped the metal slightly. These birds were working harder than they were designed for, flying mission after mission in conditions that tested every component to its breaking point, just like the people who flew them. "Vasquez, you still under there?" called Master Sergeant Rodriguez from across the hangar. "We need that bird ready in 2 hours." "Almost done, Sergeant," Elena replied, her voice slightly muffled by the aircraft's undercarriage. "Just need to replace this feed pawl, and she'll be good as new." She reached for her toolkit, fingers automatically finding the right wrench without looking. This was her domain now, the mechanical world of hydraulics and electrical systems, where problems had clear solutions and hard work always paid off. It was so different from her previous life, where success often meant things she tried not to think about anymore. The replacement parts slid into place perfectly. Elena tightened the mounting bolts to specification, then began the process of threading the ammunition feed system back through its guides. The work required absolute precision. One misaligned component could cause a catastrophic failure that might cost lives. As she worked, she could hear the distant sound of another helicopter approaching the base. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades grew louder, accompanied by the high whine of turbine engines. Elena glanced out from under the Apache to see a UH-60 Blackhawk settling onto the landing pad 50 meters away. Dust swirled in all directions as the aircraft touched down. She turned her attention back to the minigun, running through the final checks. The ammunition feed moved smoothly through its cycle. The targeting system interface showed green across the board. The barrel rotated freely on its mount. Everything was functioning within normal parameters. Elena was sliding out from under the helicopter when she heard footsteps approaching on the concrete floor. She expected to see Rodriguez or one of the other mechanics, but when she looked up, she found herself face to face with a man she'd never seen before. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of flying in harsh conditions. His flight suit bore the rank insignia of a chief warrant officer, and his name tape read, Morrison. But it wasn't his rank or uniform that caught Elena's attention. It was the way he was staring at her left shoulder. Elena followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. The sleeve of her coveralls had ridden up during her work, exposing several inches of her upper arm. There, clearly visible against her tanned skin, was the tattoo she'd gotten 8 years ago in a moment of pride and brotherhood. The trident, anchor, and eagle of the Navy SEAL insignia stood out in sharp black lines, with "The only easy day was yesterday" scripted beneath it in smaller text. Morrison's face had gone completely rigid, his eyes fixed on the tattoo with an intensity that made Elena instinctively want to take a step backward. For several long seconds, neither of them moved or spoke. "Where did you get that?" Morrison's voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in it. Elena's hand automatically moved to pull down her sleeve, covering the tattoo. "It's just some ink," she said carefully. "Nothing special," but Morrison wasn't buying it. He stepped closer, and Elena could see something flickering behind his eyes. Recognition. Maybe. Or suspicion. "That's not just some ink. That's earned ink. So I'm going to ask you again. Where did you get it?" Elena straightened to her full height, which still left her looking up at the pilot. She'd learned long ago that backing down only made situations like this worse. "I earned it the same way anyone else does. Through blood, sweat, and more pain than you probably want to hear about." Morrison's expression didn't change, but she saw his hands clench slightly at his sides. "What's your name?" "Staff Sergeant Vasquez. And you are?" "Chief Morrison. And I think we need to talk." Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Master Sergeant Rodriguez appeared around the nose of the Apache, carrying a clipboard and wearing his usual expression of harried urgency. "Vasquez, please tell me that bird is ready to fly. We just got word that Alpha Company is taking contact about 15 clicks northeast of here, and they need close air support." Elena nodded toward the minigun. "She's ready, Sergeant. All systems check out green." Rodriguez made a note on his clipboard, then noticed Morrison for the first time. "Chief, good to see you made it in. Your bird's being refueled now. Should be ready for the mission briefing." Morrison nodded but didn't take his eyes off Elena. "Roger that, Sergeant. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Rodriguez headed off toward the operations building, leaving Elena and Morrison alone again. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. "This conversation isn't over," Morrison said quietly. "After the mission, you and I are going to sit down and have a very detailed discussion about your background." Elena met his stare steadily, looking forward to it. Morrison turned and walked away. But Elena could feel him glancing back at her as he headed toward the briefing room. She waited until he was out of sight before allowing herself to breathe normally again. The tattoo on her shoulder seemed to burn under her coveralls. She'd known this moment would come eventually. It always did. Someone would recognize the ink, or notice something in the way she moved, or catch her doing something that regular mechanics weren't trained to do. The past had a way of catching up. No matter how far you ran, or how deeply you buried it. Elena gathered her tools and secured the Apache's maintenance panels. The aircraft was ready for combat, its systems functioning perfectly. In a few hours, it would be back out there, hunting through the Afghan mountains with death in its gun pods and missiles on its rails. She thought about the pilot, Morrison, and the way he'd looked at her. There had been more than suspicion in his eyes. There had been anger, maybe even betrayal. Why would a helicopter pilot care about a mechanic's military background? Unless he wasn't just any pilot. The pieces started falling into place in Elena's mind. Morrison's intensity, his immediate recognition of SEAL insignia, the way he demanded answers like someone with authority beyond his rank. She'd met men like him before, in another life. Men who operated in the shadows and dealt with threats that never made the evening news. Elena finished securing her equipment and headed for the parts storage room. She needed to log the repair work and file the appropriate paperwork. But her mind was racing with questions and possibilities. What was Morrison really doing at this forward base? Why had seeing her tattoo affected him so strongly? And what kind of detailed discussion was he planning for after the mission? The storage room was cool and quiet, a welcome relief from the heat outside. Elena sat at the small desk in the corner and opened the maintenance log, but instead of writing, she found herself staring at the blank page, while memories she'd tried to suppress came flooding back. Bud's training in Coronado, where she'd been one of only 3 women to make it through Hell Week. The specialized schools that followed. Dive training, language school, advanced weapons systems, the deployments to places that didn't officially exist, doing things that were never discussed outside of secure briefing rooms. And then the mission that changed everything. The one that ended her career as a SEAL and set her on the path that led to this remote base in Afghanistan, working on helicopters instead of hunting high-value targets. Elena shook her head and forced herself to focus on the maintenance report. The past was the past, and she'd built a new life for herself. A good life, where she could use her skills to support others without having to make the kind of choices that used to keep her awake at night. But as she wrote, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed new identity was about to come crashing down. Morrison knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to be dangerous. And in her experience, people like him didn't let go once they caught a scent. The mission briefing was probably starting about now. Morrison would be in a room full of pilots and crew chiefs, planning whatever operation had been called in response to Alpha Company's contact. Elena wondered if he was thinking about her, or if his focus was entirely on the job ahead. She finished the paperwork and filed it in the appropriate cabinet. Through the storage room's small window, She could see ground crews prepping aircraft for launch. The Apache she'd just repaired was being armed with Hellfire missiles and 30mm ammunition. In an hour, maybe less, it would be airborne and heading into combat. Elena left the storage room and walked back out onto the flight line. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red. It would have been beautiful if not for the knowledge that somewhere out there, American soldiers were fighting for their lives. She watched as pilots and crew members began emerging from the briefing building, moving with the purposeful urgency that preceded combat missions. Morrison was among them, talking intently with another pilot as they walked toward their aircraft. He glanced in Elena's direction, their eyes meeting for just a moment across the tarmac. Even at this distance, Elena could see the determination in his expression. Whatever he planned to ask her about, he wasn't going to let it go. She'd have to be ready with answers, or at least with a story that would satisfy his curiosity. The helicopters began spinning up one by one, their rotors building from a slow wop-wop to the rapid thunder that signaled imminent departure. Elena felt the familiar vibration in her chest as the engines reached full power. These machines represented the absolute cutting edge of military technology, capable of delivering precise firepower anywhere on the battlefield. She'd maintained and armed hundreds of aircraft over the years, but she'd never gotten used to watching them leave for combat. Each departure carried the possibility that the aircraft might not return, or that the people flying them might not make it home. It was a weight she carried every time she signed off on a maintenance report. Morrison's Black Hawk lifted off first, followed quickly by the Apache she'd repaired and 2 more gunships. They formed up in a loose formation and headed northeast, their running lights quickly disappearing into the gathering darkness. Elena stood on the flight line until the sound of their rotors faded completely. Then she headed back to the maintenance hangar, where other aircraft waited for her attention. There was always more work to do, always another helicopter that needed fixing. But as she walked, Elena couldn't stop thinking about the conversation that awaited her when the mission returned. Morrison had recognized something in her tattoo that went beyond simple military service. He'd seen through her carefully maintained cover identity in a matter of seconds. The question was, what did he plan to do about it? Elena picked up her tools and approached the next helicopter on the maintenance schedule. Work was the one thing that had never let her down, the one constant in a life that had seen too many changes. Whatever happened when Morrison returned, she'd face it the same way she faced everything else, one step at a time, with her eyes open and her guard up. The desert night was coming fast, and with it, answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The helicopters returned just after midnight, their running lights cutting through the darkness like fireflies against the star-filled Afghan sky. Elena was still in the hangar, working under the harsh fluorescent lights on a UA-60 that had developed hydraulic problems during its last mission. She heard the familiar sound of rotors long before she saw the aircraft approaching the landing zone. From her position beneath the Black Hawk, Elena could see the formation as it came in for landing. Morrison's aircraft touched down first, followed by the others in sequence. Even in the dim light, she could tell something had gone wrong. One of the Apaches was flying with a slight list, and she could see fluid dripping from its undercarriage as it settled onto the pad. Elena finished securing the hydraulic line she'd been working on and grabbed her emergency repair kit. Aircraft didn't usually return from missions leaking fluids unless they'd taken damage, and damaged helicopters meant potential casualties among the air crews. She jogged across the tarmac toward the Apache, her boots clicking against the concrete. The pilot was already shutting down the engines as Elena approached. She could see bullet holes along the aircraft's fuselage and a long gash in the tail boom where something had struck the metal. The leak was coming from the main transmission, which meant the helicopter had been flying on borrowed time for the last few minutes of its journey home. "How bad is it?" Elena called out to the pilot as he began his post-flight inspection. Captain Williams climbed down from the cockpit, his flight helmet tucked under his arm. "Could have been worse. We took some small arms fire during the extraction, nothing that kept us from completing the mission, but I felt the controls getting sluggish on the way back." Elena crouched next to the transmission housing and examined the damage. A lucky shot had punctured the casing, allowing hydraulic fluid to leak out slowly. It was repairable, but it would take several hours of work and a complete fluid replacement. "I can have her ready by morning." Elena told Williams. "But she's grounded until then. This isn't something you want to risk on another flight." Williams nodded and headed toward the debriefing building. As Elena watched him go, she noticed Morrison approaching from his own aircraft. The pilot's expression was unreadable in the darkness, but she could feel his attention focused on her like a laser beam. "Vasquez," he called out. "As soon as you get that bird secured, we need to talk." Elena looked up from the damaged Apache. "It's going to take me at least an hour to get her safe for overnight storage." "I'll wait." Morrison turned and walked toward the operations building, leaving Elena alone with the damaged helicopter and her growing sense of unease. She'd had the entire evening to think about their earlier encounter, and none of the possibilities she'd come up with were particularly encouraging. Elena worked quickly but carefully, draining the remaining hydraulic fluid and securing all the aircraft systems. The bullet damage would require replacement parts that might take days to arrive, but at least the helicopter was safe from further mechanical problems. By the time she finished, the base had settled into its nighttime routine. Most of the day, shift personnel had gone to their quarters, replaced by skeleton crews who would maintain security and communications until morning. Elena gathered her tools and headed toward the operations building, where she could see lights still burning in one of the briefing rooms. Morrison was waiting for her in a small conference room on the second floor. He'd changed out of his flight suit into standard ACU fatigues, and Elena noticed that his uniform lacked many of the patches and insignia that most soldiers wore. Just his rank, name tape, and a single unit patch she didn't recognize. "Close the door," Morrison said without looking up from a folder he was reading. Elena did as he asked, then took a seat across from him at the small table. The room was windowless and soundproof, the kind of place where classified briefings were held. On the table between them, she could see maps of the local area marked with various colored pins and grid coordinates. Morrison closed the folder and looked at Elena directly. "Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, currently assigned to the 3rd Combat Aviation Brigade as an aircraft armament specialist, previously stationed at Fort Campbell, Fort Hood, and Bagram Airfield. Clean service record, multiple commendations for technical expertise, no disciplinary actions." He paused, watching Elena's reaction. "That's what your official file says. But we both know that's not the whole story, is it?" Elena kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean. My service record speaks for itself." Morrison opened another folder. "Elena Maria Vasquez, born in San Antonio, Texas. Enlisted in the Navy at age 18 after graduating high school with honors. Completed basic training at Great Lakes, then advanced to Aviation Ordnanceman School in Pensacola." He flipped a page. "Served 18 months aboard the USS Nimitz before requesting transfer to Special Operations Command. Completed basic underwater demolition, SEAL training in Class 347, graduating 12th out of 23 candidates." Elena felt her chest tighten, but she maintained her poker face. "I don't know where you got that information, but it's wrong. I've been Army my entire career." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Advanced Combat Training School, Survival Evasion Resistance and Escape School, Army Ranger School, Special Forces Combat Diver School. You accumulated more specialized training in 4 years than most people see in 20. He leaned back in his chair, studying Elena's face. "Then, something happened. Something that made you transfer to the Army under a new identity, with all records of your Navy service classified at levels that require special clearance to access." Elena's mind raced. Morrison clearly had access to information that should have been buried so deeply that it would never surface, which meant he wasn't just a helicopter pilot, no matter what his uniform said. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "Someone who needs to know why a former SEAL with your background is working as a mechanic in Afghanistan instead of hunting targets in Syria or Somalia." Elena was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. She could continue to deny everything, but Morrison obviously had enough information to expose her regardless. Or she could tell him the truth and hope that whatever agenda he was pursuing didn't conflict with the new life she'd built. "My SEAL career ended 6 years ago," she said finally. "I made choices that led to consequences I couldn't live with. The Army gave me a chance to start over, to use my technical skills for something constructive instead of destructive. Morrison nodded slowly. Operation Desert Falcon. Somalia. 2018. Your team was tasked with eliminating a high-value target, who was coordinating attacks on international shipping. Elena's hands clenched involuntarily. She'd spent years trying to forget that mission, and here was a stranger reciting the details as casually as if he were reading a weather report. The target was in a compound with his family, Morrison continued. Intelligence said they would be gone, but they weren't. 3 civilians killed in addition to the primary target, a woman and 2 children. Stop, Elena said quietly, but Morrison didn't stop. The mission was classified as successful by command, but you requested immediate transfer out of the teams. Medical evaluations cited psychological trauma and recommended extended counseling. Elena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I said stop. You've made your point. You know who I am and what happened. What do you want? Morrison closed the folders and looked up at her. I want to know if the woman who completed SEAL training and spent 4 years hunting the most dangerous people in the world is still in there somewhere. Because if she is, I have a job that requires her particular skills. Elena stared at him. What kind of job? The kind that involves preventing more innocent people from dying. Morrison stood and walked to a map mounted on the wall. It showed the region around their forward operating base, marked with various tactical symbols and notations. 3 days ago, one of our reconnaissance teams discovered evidence of a new weapon system being tested by insurgent forces about 30 kilometers from here. He pointed to a location marked with a red circle. Shoulder-fired missiles, but not the usual RPGs or Soviet-era systems we've been dealing with. These are advanced, probably Chinese or Russian in origin, with guidance systems sophisticated enough to lock onto aircraft at ranges we've never seen before. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. How advanced? Advanced enough to shoot down an Apache from 8 kilometers away. Advanced enough to turn this entire region into a no-fly zone if they get deployed in significant numbers. Morrison turned back to face her. Yesterday's mission was a response to Alpha Company taking contact. But it was also reconnaissance. We needed to see if the new weapons were being used in the field. And they were. We lost a drone to one of the missiles, and 2 of our helicopters took hits that should have been impossible given the range and angles involved. Elena understood now why Morrison had been so interested in her background. A mission to eliminate advanced weapons would require someone with special operations experience. Someone who could infiltrate hostile territory and complete objectives that regular military units couldn't handle. Why not use your own people? She asked. Special Operations Command has plenty of assets in theater. Often racist. She 70 Felder, she 70 Forders building class. Morrison's expression darkened. Because we have reason to believe someone on the inside is providing intelligence to the insurgents. The locations where these weapons have appeared are all places that were supposed to be kept classified. Someone with access to our operational planning is feeding information to the enemy. Elena sat back down, her mind working through the implications. So you need someone who's outside the normal chain of command, someone who can operate independently without triggering whatever security breach exists. Exactly. Elena stared at the map, thinking about the damaged Apache she'd just repaired, and the bullet holes that had come far too close to killing its crew. If insurgent forces really had access to advanced surface-to-air missiles, every helicopter mission would become a potential death trap. What makes you think I'm the right person for this? She asked. Morrison pulled out another folder, this one containing satellite photographs and technical schematics. Because you're the only person I've found who has the right combination of skills and the right reasons for wanting to stop these weapons from being deployed. He spread the photos across the table. Your technical background means you can identify and disable complex weapons systems. Your SEAL training means you can get to places other people can't reach. And your current cover identity means you can operate without raising suspicions. Elena examined the photographs. They showed a remote compound nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ridges. Multiple buildings, defensive positions, and what looked like vehicle maintenance areas. It was the kind of target that would require careful planning and precise execution to assault successfully. I'm not that person anymore. Elena said quietly. I left that life behind for a reason. Morrison leaned across the table. How many helicopter crews have you sent out on missions since you've been here? How many pilots and gunners have you armed and fueled and watched fly away into danger? Elena didn't answer, but she knew the number was in the hundreds. Every one of those aircraft is at risk as long as these weapons are in enemy hands, Morrison continued. Every crew member who climbs into a cockpit could be flying their last mission because of technology they don't even know exists. Elena thought about Captain Williams and the bullet holes in his Apache. About the young crew chiefs and door gunners who trusted her to keep their weapons functioning properly. About all the faces she'd seen coming and going from the flight line over the past 2 years. Even if I agreed, she said, this isn't something one person can handle alone. You're talking about infiltrating a heavily defended compound and neutralizing advanced weapons systems. That's a job for a full team, Morrison nodded. Which is why it won't just be you. I've identified 3 other people with the necessary skills and the right security clearances. People who can be trusted to complete the mission without compromising operational security. Elena looked up sharply. You've been planning this for a while. Since we first discovered the weapons 3 weeks ago, I've been looking for the right people, building a team that can operate outside normal channels. Elena studied Morrison's face, trying to read what he wasn't telling her. And what happens after the mission? Assuming we succeed, what becomes of the people who helped you? They go back to their regular duties with the knowledge that they helped prevent a significant escalation in enemy capabilities. It was a non-answer. And they both knew it. Elena had been involved in enough classified operations to understand that people who knew too much sometimes found their career options severely limited. But she also understood that the alternative might be much worse. If insurgent forces really did have access to advanced anti-aircraft missiles, the entire nature of the conflict would change. Air support would become impossible. Medical evacuations would be grounded. And coalition forces would lose one of their most significant advantages. Elena looked at the map again, studying the terrain around the target compound. It was rough country, the kind of place where a small team could move undetected if they were careful and skilled. It was also the kind of place where a team could disappear without a trace if something went wrong. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Morrison gathered up the folders and photographs. You have until tomorrow night. After that, we move forward, with or without you. Elena stood and headed for the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. How did you know to look for me? What made you think a mechanic might be someone you could use? Morrison was quiet for a moment. Because 6 months ago, I watched a helicopter crew chief disarm an improvised explosive device that had been attached to their aircraft. The device was sophisticated, the kind of thing that would have required advanced training to handle safely. Elena remembered the incident. A maintenance inspection had discovered the bomb hidden in the landing gear housing, and she'd volunteered to remove it because she was the only person on the base with the necessary experience. The crew chief who disarmed that device had steady hands, extensive knowledge of explosives, and the kind of calm demeanor that comes from facing life-or-death situations multiple times, Morrison continued. Those aren't skills you learn in aircraft maintenance school. Elena opened the door. Like I said, I need time to think. Elena! Morrison called out as she stepped into the hallway. She turned back to look at him. Whatever happened in Somalia, it doesn't define who you are now. Sometimes the past gives us the tools we need to prevent future tragedies. Elena left the building and walked across the darkened base toward her quarters. The desert air was cool and clear, filled with the distant sounds of generators and radio chatter. Overhead, stars shone with the crystalline clarity that only existed in places far from artificial lights. She thought about Morrison's offer as she walked, a chance to return to the kind of work she'd once lived for, but also a risk that could destroy the peace she'd found over the past 6 years. A mission that could save lives, but might also cost her own. Elena reached her quarters and sat on the small bunk, staring at the wall where she'd hung a picture of the helicopter crews she'd worked with over the years. Faces of young men and women who trusted her to keep their aircraft running, who depended on her skills to bring them home safely. Tomorrow night, she would have to choose between the safe life she'd built and the dangerous path Morrison was offering. Between the person she'd become and the person she used to be. Either way, Elena knew that her time as just another mechanic was coming to an end. Elena stood at her tool bench the next evening, methodically cleaning and organizing equipment that was already spotless. The familiar ritual helped calm her mind as she wrestled with Morrison's deadline. Around her, the maintenance hangar hummed with its usual activity. But she felt isolated from it all. Suspended between two different versions of herself, the decision had been eating at her all day. During routine maintenance checks, her hands had moved automatically, while her mind replayed Morrison's words. During meals, she'd sat with fellow mechanics and crew chiefs, listening to their conversations about home and family while wondering if this might be the last time she'd share such normal moments. At 1,900 hours, Elena made her choice. She secured her tools, changed into clean fatigues, and walked to the operations building. Morrison was waiting in the same briefing room, along with 3 other people she didn't recognize. Vasquez, Morrison nodded as she entered. Meet the rest of the team. Elena studied the others carefully. A woman in her mid-20s with the lean build and alert posture of someone accustomed to danger. A man about Elena's age whose casual stance couldn't quite hide the coiled readiness beneath. And an older soldier whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in places most people only saw on maps. Sergeant Maria Santos, Morrison indicated the woman. Former Army Rangers, currently assigned to intelligence analysis. She speaks fluent Pashto and knows this region better than anyone. Santos nodded at Elena. Good to meet you. Staff Sergeant Jake Chen, Morrison continued, gesturing toward the younger man. Special Forces medic with advanced demolitions training. He'll handle any explosive devices we encounter. Chen's greeting was a slight smile and a professional assessment that Elena recognized from her own SEAL days. And Master Sergeant Tom Bradley. Morrison finished. 22 years in special operations. Expert marksman. And our team leader for this mission. Bradley stepped forward and offered Elena his hand. Morrison tells me you have some history with direct action missions. Elena shook his hand. Some. It's been a while. Like riding a bicycle, Bradley replied with a slight grin. You don't forget the important parts. Morrison moved to the map table and activated a projection system that filled the wall with detailed satellite imagery. Current intelligence shows the target compound houses approximately 12 to 15 hostile personnel, along with at least 3 of the advanced missile systems we discussed. Elena studied the enhanced photographs. The compound was larger than she'd initially thought, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways, vehicle garages, communications equipment, and what looked like a small arms depot were all clearly visible. Primary objective is destruction of the missile systems and any related technical documentation, Morrison continued. Secondary objective is capture of any personnel with knowledge of the weapon's origins or distribution network. Santos pointed to a section of the imagery. Approach will be from the north, using this dry riverbed for concealment. Guard patterns suggest they maintain 2-man roving patrols, but their coverage has gaps we can exploit. Chen added, I've identified the most likely storage locations for the missiles based on structural analysis of the buildings. We'll need shaped charges to ensure complete destruction without triggering sympathetic detonations. Elena felt the familiar shift in her mindset as she absorbed the tactical information. Details that would have seemed irrelevant to a mechanic suddenly took on critical importance. Sight lines, approach routes, escape options, and contingency plans all began forming in her mind. When do we move? She asked. Bradley checked his watch. Transport leaves in 2 hours. We'll establish a forward observation post tonight and move on the target tomorrow before dawn. Morrison handed Elena a equipment duffel. Your gear, everything you'll need, plus some items that should feel familiar. Elena opened the bag and found herself looking at equipment she hadn't seen in years. Night vision goggles, tactical radio, body armor, and weapons that brought back memories of other missions in other countries. At the bottom of the bag was a familiar weight, her old sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226 with custom grips worn smooth by years of use. How did you get this? Elena asked, lifting the pistol. It was listed in your personal effects when you transferred out of the teams. I thought you might want it back. Elena checked the weapon automatically, her hands moving through inspection procedures she'd performed thousands of times. The pistol was exactly as she'd left it, perfectly maintained and ready for action. "Thank you," she said quietly. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of final preparations. Elena changed into tactical clothing that felt strange after years of coveralls and work boots. She tested communications equipment, verified weapons function, and reviewed maps until every detail was burned into her memory. At 2,100 hours, the team loaded into an unmarked civilian vehicle for transport to their insertion point. Elena found herself sitting next to Santos as they drove through the dark landscape beyond the base perimeter. "You nervous?" Santos asked quietly. Elena considered the question. "More like focused. It's been a long time since I've done anything like this. Morrison says you were Navy before. Special operations? SEALs. But that was another life." Santos nodded. "I get it. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried as deep as we'd like." They drove in comfortable silence after that, each team member lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for what lay ahead. Elena watched the countryside roll past through night vision equipment, automatically noting terrain features and potential hazards. The insertion point was a rocky outcrop, about 5 kilometers from the target compound. The team unloaded their equipment and watched the vehicle disappear back toward base, leaving them alone in the vast Afghan darkness. Bradley took point as they moved toward their objective, setting a pace that covered ground quickly while maintaining noise discipline. Elena found her body remembering movements she hadn't used in years. How to step silently on loose rock, how to use terrain for concealment, how to communicate with hand signals in total darkness. They reached the observation post at 0200 hours and established overwatch positions that provided clear views of the compound below. Elena adjusted her night vision scope and studied the target in detail for the first time. The intelligence photographs had been accurate, but they hadn't conveyed the isolation of the location. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by steep ridges, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound between rocky outcroppings. It was a natural fortress, defensible against anything but a major military assault. "Guard rotation every 30 minutes, Chen whispered over the radio. "2-man teams, standard patrol routes." Elena watched the guards move through their circuits, noting their discipline and alertness levels. These weren't amateur fighters. They moved with the confidence and precision of trained soldiers. Bradley's voice crackled softly in her earpiece. "Santos, what do you see in the communications building?" Santos adjusted her scope. "Multiple antenna arrays. Probably satellite uplinks. Could be command and control for a larger network." Elena focused on a large concrete structure that dominated the center of the compound. "Building 3 looks like it's built to withstand explosions. Probably where they're storing the missiles." "Aye. Agreed," Bradley replied. "Chen, how much explosive will you need to ensure complete destruction?" "Depends on what's inside. If it's just the missiles, standard charges should work. But if they're manufacturing or modifying the weapons, we might need thermite to destroy technical equipment." Elena studied the compound's layout, mentally planning their approach route. The dry riverbed Santos had identified would provide concealment for most of the approach. But the last 100 meters would require crossing open ground under potential observation. "I see a way in," she said quietly. "Southern perimeter, near the vehicle garage. There's a gap in the fence line where the terrain drops away. Looks like they're relying on the slope for security, but it's climbable." Bradley examined the area through his scope. "Good eye. That should get us inside without triggering the motion sensors near the main entrance." They spent the remaining hours before dawn, refining their plan and timing their assault to coincide with the guards' shift change. Elena felt the old familiar sensation of time slowing down as her mind shifted into combat mode, processing details with the enhanced clarity that came from knowing lives depended on perfect execution. At 0515 hours, Bradley gave the signal to move. The team descended from their observation post in single file, using the pre-dawn darkness to mask their approach. Elena took her assigned position in the formation, her weapon ready and her senses hyper-alert to any sign of detection. The approach went exactly as planned. They reached the fence line undetected and used wire cutters to create an entry point near the vehicle garage. Elena was first through the gap, scanning for threats while the others followed. Inside the compound, they split into two pairs as rehearsed. Bradley and Santos moved toward the communications building, while Elena and Chen headed for the missile storage facility. Elena's heart rate was elevated but controlled as she led the way along the shadows of the compound's outer buildings. The storage building was massive up close, its concrete walls at least 2 feet thick and reinforced with steel mesh. Elena examined the security measures while Chen prepared his demolitions equipment. "Electronic locks," Elena whispered. "But the backup system is mechanical. I can get us in." Elena pulled a lockpick set from her gear and went to work on the mechanical system. Her hands moved with muscle memory from countless training exercises, feeling for the subtle clicks and resistance that indicated each pin falling into place. The lock opened with a soft snick that seemed impossibly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Elena pushed the heavy door open just enough for them to slip inside. The sight that greeted them was worse than they'd expected. The storage building contained not 3 missile systems, but 12. Advanced shoulder-fired weapons with guidance packages that looked far more sophisticated than anything they'd encountered in the region. "Holy shit," Chen breathed. "These aren't just anti-aircraft missiles. Look at the targeting systems." Elena examined one of the weapons more closely and felt her blood run cold. The guidance package was designed for multiple target types: aircraft, vehicles, even personnel. This wasn't just an anti-aircraft threat. It was a complete game-changer for the entire conflict. "Chen, start placing charges," Elena said urgently. "We need to destroy all of this." As Chen worked, Elena moved deeper into the building and discovered something even worse. Technical manuals and training materials were stacked on tables, written in multiple languages including English. Someone was preparing to distribute these weapons to insurgent groups throughout the region. Elena's radio crackled with Bradley's voice. "We've got movement in the compound. Guards are responding to something. How much longer do you need?" Elena looked at the rows of weapons and the massive amount of explosive that would be required to destroy them all. "At least 10 more minutes for complete destruction. You've got 5. After that, we're going to have company." Elena and Chen worked frantically to place charges on every missile system and ammunition cache in the building. The explosives had to be positioned precisely to ensure complete destruction while preventing sympathetic detonations that might level the entire compound. "Done," Chen announced as he set the final charge. 60 seconds after we trigger the remote." They slipped out of the storage building and began moving toward the extraction point. But as they rounded the corner of a maintenance shed, Elena found herself face to face with an insurgent guard who was just as surprised to see her. For a split second, both Elena and the guard hesitated. Then training took over. Elena's hand moved to her sidearm with the speed and precision of countless hours of practice. The P-226 cleared its holster and fired twice before the guard could raise his weapon. The suppressed shots were barely audible, but Elena knew their time was up. Other guards would investigate when their partner failed to check in. "Moving to extraction," Elena whispered into her radio as she and Chen broke into a run. Behind them, shouts erupted from various parts of the compound as more guards discovered signs of the intrusion. Elena heard the distinctive sound of safety switches being disengaged and magazines being loaded into assault rifles. Bradley and Santos were already at the extraction point when Elena and Chen arrived. The team moved quickly through the gap in the fence and began their escape route toward the dry riverbed. 30 seconds, Chen announced, holding the detonation trigger. Elena looked back at the compound one last time, thinking about all the lives that would be saved by the destruction of those weapons, about the helicopter crews who would fly their missions without knowing how close they'd come to facing a threat that could have killed them all. Chen pressed the trigger. The explosion that followed lit up the entire valley like sunrise. The storage building simply disappeared in a ball of fire and smoke, taking with it the most advanced weapons Elena had ever seen in insurgent hands. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel stores were caught in the blast. The team moved quickly away from the compound as debris began falling around them. Elena felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as they climbed toward their extraction point. The mission was a success, but it had required her to become someone she'd hoped never to be again. 4 hours later, they were back at the forward operating base. Elena changed back into her maintenance coveralls and returned to the hangar as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Morrison found her that evening as she worked on a routine hydraulic repair. "The weapons you destroyed yesterday were part of a shipment of 50 units. Intelligence suggests the other systems are being distributed to cells across 3 countries. Elena looked up from her work. "So this isn't over?" "Not even close. We'll need to find and destroy the remaining weapons before they can be deployed." Elena considered this for a moment. "Are you asking me to make this permanent?" Morrison shrugged. "I'm saying that there's more work to be done, and you're good at it. The choice is yours." Elena returned to her repair work, but her mind was already planning. The mechanic's life she'd built had been a safe one, but it hadn't been complete. The mission had reminded her that she had skills and training that could make a real difference in the world. 2 days later, Elena submitted a request for transfer to a classified unit under Morrison's command. She would keep her cover as a mechanic, but her real work would be the kind of missions that prevented the deaths of innocent people. She thought about Somalia as she signed the transfer papers, about the family that had died because of her actions, and about the hundreds of families that would live because of what she'd done in that Afghan valley. Elena had spent 6 years running from her past. Now she was going to use it to build a better future. The war wasn't over, and neither was she.